For this session, we're going to be bringing the Bible into the conversation. What does the Bible say about modern slavery? And joining me today is the Tearfund Education Specialist, Dale Campbell. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ido.
So, Dale, this is obviously a pretty complex one. I suspect you'd agree with me in saying that the Bible has a pretty strong stance against slavery, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not quite as clear-cut as going, okay, I'll take that verse, and there we have it, right?
You're right. You've got verses that are used to justify the slave trade, and then you've got the abolitionists, which use other parts of the Bible to try to bring it to an end. And so, there's no convenient proof text that ends all forms of slavery for all times and all places.
And so there's nothing that says, well, here it is, conclusive, done. And I guess, question, is that because of the way that the Bible was put together, written for different people in different times, maybe?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. I don't think you have God speaking in one way to one type of people. I think God is present in history, throughout history, working and speaking and revealing more and more of His will. It's almost like God seems to meet people where they are and also cultures where they are.
So God's meeting people where they're at. So using that logic, obviously in the Bible, He was speaking to the Romans, the Egyptians, and they obviously had a lot of slaves. Yes. And then on the other hand, there were those people that were, caught or vulnerable and were oppressed in some way. And their only resort was to sell themselves or sell members of their family, right? So I guess we're saying, or are you saying that, God's speaking to these people where they're at, He's meeting them where they're at as a starting point, and then we're going to see how we can make it better from there?
That's right. I mean, even today when you're trying to change someone's attitudes or their actions, it takes time. And sometimes if you try to change someone too quickly, it can actually have the opposite effect.
Mm-hmm. Right, so let's dig a little deeper into some of the detail of what the Bible says. Let's start with the Old Testament. How does the Bible begin to start speaking against slavery in the Old Testament?
Well, it starts with really the law of Moses in the Old Testament. You had these various regulations around how slaves were to be treated or first acquired even. For example, you were allowed to purchase a slave but not steal another human being. That was strictly forbidden.
Right, okay, so in some way there was some rules around how slaves were to be acquired.
That's right. And the focus comes in the law of Moses on how slaves are treated. One way to summarize it would be to say that the Bible begins to get slave masters to treat their slaves to ensure their quality of life, right? That's what it's about. The Bible takes a normal practice and tries to move it towards a just way of existing.
So in some cases it would have been, historically normal to have these slaves, treat them unfairly, beat them, sometimes to death. And then the Bible says, actually, no. Let's stop here. Let's do this properly. Let's treat them with some dignity, some respect, right? To start with. That's
right. It's trying to move it into a situation that benefits everyone. And so instead of slavery locking in someone to a situation where they'd have no hope of ever paying off their debt, there's this practice that was introduced called Jubilee that recommended letting them go in the 7th year. And so for many, if you were set free, you just were right back in the world of poverty again and insecurity and vulnerability, right? And so if you set a slave free, you were supposed to supply them liberally with resources.
So in some ways that, having a shelter, having a place to sleep, having food every day, that was a better option for them. And I guess, were there some circumstances where they preferred not to be sent away in Jubilee?
Absolutely. There's evidence in scriptures that sometimes people would love their master and their family, and they'd ask to stay. And now we're not trying to minimize slavery, the reality of this, that it wasn't an ideal situation. But it's just to acknowledge that there's different forms of slavery, and sometimes this situation could actually be better than another situation.
Right, and I guess that's the complexity to it, eh? There's no black and white. It's saying that right in this point in time, although not ideal, it's better for someone to have food, shelter, I guess a place to live, than to be out on the street and have another bad situation and be enslaved by someone else, right?
Yeah. It's taking away the worst forms of slavery first, and then with the forms that are left, trying to make those places of kindness and almost hospitality, almost like employment.
What about the New Testament? I imagine there's a similar vibe going on there. Slave is not so much supported as it's assumed that it exists. But how does the New Testament talk about it?
That's right. Here's an analogy. Like in the same way that the New Testament does not support Jews being enslaved by the Romans, the New Testament also does not support people being slaves. Jews wanted to be free of Roman rule, of course, and Jesus actually, in that context, Jesus instructed them not to rebel against the Romans because that would end up being worse for them, as it happened in AD 70. Now, the same thing with slavery. If you're in slavery, okay, that's your situation. Now, how can you act in a way that is good for you and for everyone?
Should we take a little, we're talking about the Bible, should we take a little deep dive into the Bible and look at a key passage here in Ephesians 6, verses 5 to 9. Paul says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether they are slaves or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism there." Like that sets this foundation of respect and kindness, right? And this understanding that we are both under the same master and the creator, essentially, right?
That's right. Paul does so much in that. Like, first of all, he encourages slaves, like I said earlier, to behave in a way towards their master in a way that was good for the master, but also for them. But also, more significantly, he commands masters to act respectfully to the slave and don't threaten them. But even more significantly, you have this language of, like you said, God is both their master and theirs. And so there's this no favoritism. They're placed on an equal standing under God.
That's brilliant. And then in the book of Philemon, in a very, very short chapter, we see that play out personally, right?
It's one of my favorite examples. It's so good. Like, Paul turns the institution on its head. So he's writing to Philemon, this wealthy former slave owner that owned this slave who was called Onesimus. Now, the name Onesimus means useful, and Paul uses that as a wordplay to say that, hey, Philemon, you've seen Onesimus as useless, but he is Onesimus. He is useful, not only to me as Paul, but to you as well. And more than that, he says, not just take him back, but take him back as a dear brother. And he says, God is Onesimus's master, and he's also our master as well. So we're all on one footing.
Everyone's placed on the same level.
That's right. It's game changing.
That's awesome. So, it's essentially everyone's placed on the same level. Like, sure, it would have been great if Paul said, hey, ban all slaves. But what he's really doing is it's a bit of a game changer here, like you said.
That's right. He's challenging paradigms. He's undercutting the whole Greco-Roman system of rank and status and putting slave and free on the same footing, just as he would with Jew and Gentile or male and female. So he's just changing the world effectively.
And then he uses that term to describe himself, right?
Yeah.
Calls himself a slave.
Consistently, often at the start of his letters. And even in Philippians 2, he even uses that word for Jesus, about taking the nature of a servant or a slave.
And do other writers throughout the New Testament do the same, or is it just Paul?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of this is tucked away in the book of Revelation. So John, the seer, is writing his apocalypse. And he's, towards the end, the final chapters, he's contrasting the bride of Christ and the harlot or whore of Babylon. And so many people many scholars believe that Babylon is Rome, present day Rome for him. And a part of his judgment at the end is in chapter 18. There's this list of all these goods and resources, stuff, things that were being consumed by the Roman Empire, sucked in to be consumed, right? And in this list is exhaustive. It has things like gold, precious stones, fabrics, timbers, ivory, ingredients, spices, cattle, horses, that kind of stuff. Guess what the list ends with? The bodies and souls of humans. And so it's effectively saying that this trade is enslaving, and it actually enslaves people. It's a profound judgment on slavery.
Well, thank you so much for sharing light on, what can sometimes be a bit of a confusing subject in the Bible.
Totally.
And showing us, giving us some clarity on that. It was really good.
Cheers.
Yeah.